This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. Do I need to remind you of the difference between the news headlines that Thomas and his colleagues take care of on the programme and then the bit that we do together? Because it is one of those mornings, isn't it, where you can't help thinking that the thing that we're going to talk about is something that we probably shouldn't be talking about because there are much more important things going on, notably internationally in Ukraine and in Gaza. But the I mean, you know, the reality of it is that conversation is not dictated by news headlines. It's almost like a confession of a slight sense of embarrassment that I really want to get stuck into a conversation about the Tories' latest travails and the walking disaster that is 30p Lee Anderson in particular. Where to begin? Well, I thought we might begin with the career of this man, who has become a focal point for Tory stresses. And it is an extraordinary career. I mean, in all the wrong ways. He first sort of came into politics as a Labour councillor. He was the office manager for the Labour MP Gloria de Piero, and then sat as a Labour councillor on Ashfield District Council. I think that he got suspended from that role by his own constituency party after allegations, or after he received some sort of punishment for behaviour that was perceived to be biased against the travellers community. He tried to then get back onto the district council, as I understand it, but was turned down because he allegedly engaged in sexist language at the interview. He then decided to try to get a gig with the Ashfield Independents. This is what Anna Soubry, the Conservative MP in the neighbouring constituency, has revealed. But they didn't want him, so he went to the Tories, who snapped him up. And on the what would you call them? The coattails of madness that Boris Johnson managed to extend to unreached corners of the previously unreached corners of the country, carried all sorts of flotsam and jetsam into the House of Commons in 2019. So far, so ordinary. There are an awful lot of obviously and profoundly unsuitable and inadequate politicians who ended up on the ballot paper in 2019, and because of the curious aligning of planets, planet Brexit, planet Boris Johnson, planet Jeremy Corbyn, because of that mad alignment of various diabolical planets, these obvious inadequates made their way into Parliament for one term in most cases. It's hard to imagine many of them hanging on. And remarkably, listen, 30p Lee is not in and of himself an interesting individual. Far from it, but he's a very interesting exemplar of much broader issues, because he is the perfect example of just how low the bar had fallen when it came to selecting candidates for 2019. You could have a fellow who was working for the Labour Party 10 minutes ago, but the recognition that they wouldn't be able to fight the next election on substantive issues. This is quite interesting, because he accidentally said it out loud, didn't he? You won't be able to fight the next election on substantive issues. He did a sort of strange YouTube. Listen, I'll confess something to you, right? The middle of last week, I had to deliver the extra chapter for the paperback version of my book. So How They Broke Britain. I know I've been going on about it a lot lately, but only because it's in my mind. I'll calm down a bit until the paperback comes out in May. I promise. But it just means that my mind is a little bit more focused than yours is on some of the things that are going on at the moment. So the 10 chapters, 10 people, How They Broke Britain. The extra chapter, the new chapter, is Rishi Sunak. And I had to pick examples of Rishi Sunak's awfulness. And obviously reappointing Suella Braverman to the Home Office was one of them. And shortly after I decided that would be contained in the chapter, he fired her. And then on Wednesday, I actually sent to the publisher the finished chapter in which Lee Anderson is used as another exemplar of what we could sarcastically describe as Rishi Sunak's talent spotting skills. And that's why I've got all this filed away quite near the surface of my brain, because he gave an interview to YouTube in which he said the quiet bit out loud. I mean, imagine being the party leader and hearing someone that you think, because you've lived such a cosseted, privileged, ludicrously insulated existence, you think that Lee Anderson is somehow representative of what you call the working class. That you hear him actually say, we've got nothing to fight the next election on. Because at the last one, it was all about Boris Johnson, Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn. They were the three things that would come up on the doorstep, and not in that order. It was the way that Corbyn had alienated huge swathes of traditional Labour voters. People were persuaded that Brexit was A, still worth doing, and C, they were persuaded that Boris Johnson was the person that could do it. That's 2019 in a nutshell. No one would really disagree with that. But Lee Anderson said it all out loud, and he said what we're going to have to fight the next election on is culture wars and transgender toilets, or culture wars and trans people, transgender people. And you sort of sat there and thought, oh, crikey, that even if that's true, you're not supposed to say it out loud. You're supposed to pretend you're going to fix the NHS or help people get ahead or improve the economy or improve schools or hospitals. You're not supposed to actually say that we are such an ideologically bankrupt organisation after 14 years of power. We can't take responsibility for any of the problems in the country because we've caused them. And we can't campaign on anything that sort of falls into the future because we haven't got anything to offer people. Even if we did have something to offer people, anybody sensible could turn around and say, well, you've had 14 years to deliver that. Why haven't you done it sooner? So those 5 pledges of Rishi Sunak sort of crash headlong into his decision to appoint 30p Lee as deputy chairman of the Conservative Party 2 weeks after he conceded that the Tories don't have an ideological pot to pee in, and they'd be reduced to fighting an entire general election campaign on bigotry and hatred, or culture wars and transgender people. Of course, part of the problem he's got is that weirdo who was just in with Nick has already tried to stick a flag in all of the culture war transgender ground. So the idea that the Tories are going to have to tack in that direction becomes even more electorally baffling. So that's where they are. That's where they are. That's not an opinion. That's just counting. And we haven't even mentioned the time that he insulted people who are struggling to feed their families. He accepted a 10-grand pay rise, I was reading yesterday, not long ago, from the head of the Tory party, because they were worried he wouldn't be able to get by on his MP salary plus his GBB's bonuses. So there we are. That's who he is. And then he came out with this stuff about Sadiq Khan, which is not as bad, objectively, as what Suella Braverman has come out with. And it is not as bad as, or it is at least as bad as what Zach Goldsmith campaigned on when he sought to become Mayor of London. I'm not sure you can put much of a cigarette paper between the three positions. But Boris Johnson was leader when Zach Goldsmith was indulged in anti-Muslim hatred towards Sadiq Khan, and he ended up in the House of Lords. Rishi Sunak was leader when Suella Braverman indulged in anti-Muslim hatred, and she got fired, but not for that. And Rishi Sunak was leader when Lee Anderson indulged in clearly anti-Muslim or Islamophobia, and he got fired. He got suspended from the entire party for that. Okay. So that's where we are. I'm not even going to do the usual thing of apologising if you don't like that analysis, because if you don't like that analysis, you don't like the truth. You can't handle the truth. That's just what has happened. That's how someone as objectively ridiculous can end up as deputy chairman of the Conservative Party 1 minute. Well, no, who can end up as a Labour Party councillor 1 minute, deputy chair of the Conservative Party the next minute, and then out on his arse the minute after that, with obviously that Richard Tice fella sniffing around for electoral opportunism. So that is what happens. That is what happened. Whoever tacks further to the right of the Tory party, who can't get much further to the right, picks up the sort of drippings from the table that look like Lee Anderson. Or back in the day, of course, Douglas Carswell. So that's where we are. That's what's happened. But what I don't understand is how a minister can end up in the mess that this fellow ended up in this morning. And you can tell it's serious, because I'm going to play a clip from the Nick Ferrari show, which doesn't happen on a regular basis, but when it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. Listen to this clown.
Why was it necessary for Lee Anderson to have the whip suspended? Where was the tolerance there?
Well, Nick, respectfully, I think what Lee said was wrong.
Yes.
And as a result of what he said, he had the whip removed from him. That's
But
robust
what was it
action.
specifically that meant the whip had to go? We agree it was wrong, but why was it wrong?
Nick, it was wrong. What Lee
but why was
said,
it wrong?
What he said was wrong. As a result of what he said, the whip was removed from him. That was robust action.
No,
that
but
was
why
robust
was it
action
wrong?
that was
That's what
taken.
I'm trying to get at.
It was wrong, Nick, because of what he said, and robust action was taken as a result.
You're well-educated now. Let's try this a different way. Was it Islamophobic?
What he said was wrong, and robust action was taken, and the whip was removed within 24 hours.
Minister, was it Islamophobic?
Nick, it was wrong.
Minister, I'm going to, and I'm normally a very polite man, I'm actually going to effectively put the fact, I'll ask you now for the third time, I've asked you 6 times why it was necessary. For the third time, was it Islamophobic?
Nick, it was wrong.
I'll have to curtail the interview there. I'm grateful for your time, but enough already. Michael Tomlinson is the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, unable to answer a question.
It's not a great look, is it? And a lot of you pointing out that the rather splendid Rosie Holt's parodies of Conservative politicians often wouldn't sound quite as implausible as that. So they can't tell you what Lee Anderson has done wrong. And that is the bit that I don't get. I may have made a slight mistake a moment ago. Theresa May was leader when Zach Goldsmith ran for London Mayor, but Boris Johnson was leader when Zach Goldsmith got put in the House of Lords. I suspect he's keeping his head down at the moment, because if he pops it above any parapets at all, people will be wondering what the difference is between what 30p Lee has done and what he did when he was running for Mayor of London. So 10:15 is the time. If you want to have a crack at the big question, I'd really like to hear what you've got to say on this issue. So let us talk about Islamophobia, which is, I think, a slightly more difficult word than some people allow, because it suggests that you would not be allowed to criticise Islam at all, and you should be free to criticise all religions. It's it's not that long ago in this country where you could be burnt at the stake for criticising somebody else's flavour of Christianity. So there's nothing unique to Islam about extremism or about literalism, but at this particular window in human history, they have certainly got a much tighter grip on that kind of ideology than most Christian countries or most Christian identifying countries do. A woman, I think, in Pakistan has just had to be rescued from a baying mob because there was some writing upon her outfit in Arabic that people mistook for quotes from the Quran. So, and then of course you had people picketing a chicken shop in Bradford because the bloke inside was selling Coca-Cola. So there can be some borderline lunatic behaviour in all sorts of contexts that are often described as religious, when frankly they're not. There's something a little bit... But that's why Islamophobia is a slightly more complex characterisation than some people allow. I'm perfectly comfortable with it. I know what I mean by it. It is a view that Muslim people are somehow inferior or to be treated with suspicion or, by definition, dangerous. And that is exactly what Lee Anderson indulged in. So I do understand. I think some people perhaps claim that the word is unhelpful in good faith. I'm not sure. A lot of the people claiming that the word is unhelpful do so because they're Islamophobes and they don't like the idea of a label being hung around their neck. So that I get up to a point. But it's clear what Lee Anderson did wrong. Lee Anderson essentially accused Sadiq Khan of being in cahoots with extremists, which is close to a synonym for terrorists, solely because Sadiq Khan is a Muslim man. A Muslim man who, incidentally, is routinely praised by the British Board of Deputies of British Jews for his work with that section of the city that he governs and his overall attitudes to issues of interfaith cooperation and what I suppose we'd have to call multiculturalism. So I heard a caller at the end of Nick's show claiming that he hadn't done anything for the Jewish community, which the Jewish community would disagree with. When Susan Hall tried to malign him for being sort of low-level anti-Semitic, it was Jewish people who came out and condemned her quite correctly. So how have the Tories got themselves into such a mess to the point where an immigration minister can tell a radio presenter, right, Nick Ferrari in this case, can tell a radio presenter that 30p Lee had to lose the whip because he'd done something wrong, but he couldn't tell the radio presenter what 30p had done wrong? How have they got themselves into such a mess? 18 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. So I'd take as broad a sweep at this as you like, because in a way you could include promoting him to deputy chair and then having to suspend him. It's extraordinary, really, promoting Braverman to Home Secretary and then having to sack her. How has Rishi Sunak got into such a mess? But how have the Tories got themselves into such an extraordinary mess over somebody as ridiculous and in normal times as horribly insignificant as 30p Lee Anderson? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And we may also throw into the mix the question of what you think Lee Anderson did wrong, so that if Michael Tomlinson is doing any more interviews later today, he will at least be able to answer that question.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
What's the difference between a vice and a deputy? I don't know. So Paul Scully was vice chairman of the Conservative Party for the London region, from 2017 to 2019. And he resurrected one of the worst racist tropes yesterday, talking about no-go areas in Spark Hill, in Birmingham, and in Tower Hamlets. One of my colleagues lives in Tower Hamlets. She was staggered this morning to find out that she lived in a no-go zone. So the questions about how they've got themselves into such a mess can sometimes be answered with other questions. Why could Michael Tomlinson not tell Nick Ferrari what Lee Anderson had done wrong? Answer: because of Paul Scully. Maybe. I don't know. I want to hear what you think. Haziq's in Stoke. Haziq, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. So I want to talk about sort of Lee Anderson and his comments.
Okay.
So, I want to be
from the point of view of telling Michael Tomlinson what he should have said when he was asked what Lee Anderson had done wrong. Well, that'll be helpful for him at least.
So, look, I don't know if Lee Anderson is Islamophobic, right? That's for him to decide. But his comments were, I think, in my own opinion, right? Yeah. Now, suggesting that Islamists have taken over Sadiq Khan, Keir Starmer in London, that's perpetuating harmful stereotypes about Muslims. Yes. But I'm a Muslim myself, right? And I've grown up through the ages of, these terrorist attacks that were happening in Manchester and London. I was only in high school at the time, and I remember walking back through the city centre, and I was in school uniform. I had bacon thrown at me. I was called a terrorist. I was told to get out of the country, this kind of thing. No one talked about the Islamophobia then. And
some of us did. Some of us tried to. But the conflation of extremists and or terrorists with everybody of your faith was quite deliberate and profoundly dangerous, and it has found a home now in the upper echelons of the Conservative Party. On a lighter note, you must be very relieved to learn that Rishi Sunak has said he is living proof that Britain isn't racist. So there must have been other reasons for that abuse that you endured on the streets of Stoke-on-Trent back in the day. Anyway, we digress. Carry on with your analysis of 30p.
So he's essentially what he did was he linked Islamists with control, right, and implied that Muslim individuals are unfit for leadership positions. Yeah. And now,
that's a really good point. I've overlooked that. That's not even an implication, is it? It's stating that you can't trust a Muslim politician.
Yeah, because Sadiq Khan is a Muslim politician, and you're basically you're implying it, and you're linking Islamists with that Muslim politician, and you're feeding into the mind of your supporters, and there are very strong Lee Anderson supporters out there, and who do want to conflate everybody of your faith with the Manchester Arena bomber, for example. you see it on social media all the time. I can't scroll through social media without seeing certain comments about people saying, I 100% agree with Lee Anderson.
No, same here.
I believe that Islamists have taken over this, that, and the other.
To be honest, most of those accounts don't actually have real names on them. They are Billy Bunch 100%. Of numbers with a bulldog avatar. But there are certainly people out there. They're one imagines they're the kind of people that vote for the Reclaim or Reform Party. I always get them the wrong way around. The one that's not led by the lad who was in Lewis but wasn't Lewis, but is led by the other bloke who inherited a ton of money and spent it on becoming a pretend politician. So we know these people exist.
Yeah, so the second part of this is why that Conservative minister who was interviewed by Nick just previously didn't want to deny it. Now, it's an election year, right? So in my own opinion, I'm thinking it's political strategy and a bit of defensiveness. So, if you're a Conservative politician and if you alienate your voter base by acknowledging Islamophobia, they might believe that openly admitting to Islamophobia could damage their electoral prospects or reputation.
No, The Guardian has a story about Tory activists turning on Rishi Sunak today and calling him a snake as a consequence of the suspension.
It's crazy, absolutely crazy. And, it's a bit of defensiveness as well, right? Because, could it be a defensive reaction aimed at protecting the party's image? Now, you've got, Rishi Sunak, who, and I even remember speaking to you about Suella Braverman's comments, right? Not too long ago. And, she, if I remember correctly, she didn't actually get suspended for those comments. She got suspended for something else.
Writing an article attacking the police, I think, was it wasn't quite clear at the time. There was a little bit of speculation about what the main reason was, but it certainly followed fast upon her claim that the policing of protests had been biased, and that was after she came pretty close to inciting those far-right attacks on the police on Remembrance Sunday. So it was an extraordinary intervention for a woman who has had at the time overall control of policing. So you're going to take me up to the news, so I just want to focus in on this. So Tomlinson today couldn't answer the question of what Lee Anderson had done wrong because he's worried that lots of Conservative voters, whatever description he came up with, would think that Lee Anderson had actually done right.
Yes, 100%. And
well, then Sunak's put them all in a pocket, hasn't he?
Yeah, there you go. I mean, look, the final bit I want to say regarding your original question about, how the Conservative Party got themselves into such a mess is because they failed to address the concern straight away. They waited at least 48 hours before they even acknowledged any wrongdoing. And that's not even taken into account saying it's Islamophobic because they haven't done that yet. Yeah. They've just said it's wrong. I mean,
but we can't tell you why.
Yeah. What was wrong? Well, you don't get suspended for nothing.
No, you don't get suspended for nothing, but we can't tell you what he's done wrong that he's been suspended for, even though everybody knows it was comments he made about Sadiq Khan and in particular Muslims in general. But we can't tell you what was wrong with it because we appreciate that so many of our voters would probably disagree with whatever we described as Lee Anderson's wrongdoing. And then you're left with this extraordinary Times front page where Rishi Sunak is saying that you can prove, do you know how you can prove that Britain's not racist? Because I'm Prime Minister, with which there are two problems. The first is no one actually voted for him to become Prime Minister. And the second is when he tried to become Prime Minister or leader of the Conservative Party against a rival candidate, he lost. And the rival candidate was Liz Truss. So if there is no racism, for example, among the Conservative Party membership, you're left with the frankly terrifying conclusion that they looked at Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak and decided that Liz Truss was more talented. It's 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The phone lines are open and Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:34. Robin Maidenhead writes, and I think unintentionally makes an excellent point. If a hardcore element of a faith espouses and behaves dangerously, why shouldn't that cast a doubt over the whole of that faith? The answer, Rob, is easy. He adds, isn't that natural and isn't it forgivable without accusations of phobia or hate? No, mate, because the word faith means belief. So if a hardcore element of a faith believes the same thing as the rest of the faith, then they're not a hardcore element. But if you're taking the beliefs of what you describe as a hardcore element and claiming that everybody who subscribes to the same word to describe their beliefs and their faith is also hardcore and dangerous, then you're indulging in bigotry and prejudice. And of course it's not natural or forgivable any more than suggesting that a Catholic even at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, suggesting that every Catholic was in favour of sticking heretics on the rack and stretching them until they snapped and confessed their admiration for the Dark Lord Beelzebub, mate. That's the point about faith, is that if two people share the same faith, the same beliefs, then neither of them is the hardcore element. So extremism is another word you might want to familiarise yourself with. Extremism distinguishes people from moderates. So it is precisely where so much Islamophobia comes from, that people are determined to pretend that all moderates are secretly extremists. And so that is why, without realising it, you've provided a really neat analysis of what Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred looks like. It's a belief that all Muslims are extremists and or terrorists or dangerous or suspicious or can't be trusted in government, which is what, of course, 30p Lee said so. And you're doing it based upon behaviours of a tiny minority of people who happen to use the same word to describe completely different beliefs. You're welcome. That's the end of my TED Talk. So how did the Tories get themselves into such a mess? To the point where is he the immigration minister or the illegal immigration minister? What a stupid title that is. Honestly, the illegal immigration minister. How did they get themselves into such a position where the illegal immigration minister can say it's absolutely right that one of my colleagues has lost the whip for doing wrong, but can't tell you what he's actually done wrong? There is a school of thought that suggests he forgot what the line was. But two people have suggested that to me this morning, two colleagues here at LBC Towers. And I said to both of them, well, what is the line? To which they both responded by rolling their eyes and going, well, don't ask me. So the generous analysis is that Michael Tomlinson, when asked by Nick Ferrari what Lee Anderson had actually done wrong, the generous answer to that question is he forgot what he was supposed to say. But the people offering up the generous analysis can't tell me what it was they think he was supposed to say. And that is quite an almighty mess. I think Rishi Sunak is in, with Islamophobia now, a similar position to which both of the last two Labour leaders have found themselves with regard to anti-Semitism. The question is Rishi Sunak going to end up looking like Jeremy Corbyn, or is he going to get it right and end up looking like Keir Starmer? Peter's in Epsom. Peter, how did it happen?
It's because if they say out loud what it is that Anderson did, they have to admit that other people who have power and influence that they can't control have done the same thing. Braverman's comments, you could have Jesuitical arguments about whether it was worse because Anderson named a particular mayor or worse because Braverman said it was the whole country rather than just London. But she wrote her articles as a considered, carefully thought out piece in a national newspaper.
So I don't know what Nick had up his sleeve this morning, but if almost any answer you're suggesting that Michael Tomlinson gave, the interviewer could then have responded by saying, well, hang on a minute, Suella Braverman said this.
Precisely. And as soon as they do that, then they have to admit that other people have done things that are just as bad, but people like Braverman, who have such a power base within the party, that kicking her out would cause an absolute furore and a meltdown in the Tory party.
And one begins to wonder whether they're actually flirting with that sort of thing. People like Braverman, when they push the envelope a little further. I think she was on Twitter last night, essentially doubling down on what she'd said. 30p has I know he's lost the whip, but he's doubled down on what he said. One of them is in the party and one of them isn't. And I think your explanation as to why that might be is very simply, I don't know if she is that popular, but she's certainly more of a rallying point for that that feeling, isn't she? She's more of a rallying point for that sort of very right-wing, borderline extremism than 30p Lee has managed to be.
Well, I don't have much of a sense for myself of what's going on in the Tory party, but that is what I read, that Braverman has a large following, and that if you were to attack her or kick her out of the party or withdraw the whip, then it would cause chaos within the Tory ranks.
So, I mean, it will be interesting to see what happens in the coming days, but really any politician, any Conservative asked about what Lee Anderson did wrong is going to find themselves in a similarly tricky position.
Yeah, they're in an impossible position. If they admit what he's done, then they will have no way of hiding that others like Braverman had done the same thing or worse.
So why did Sunak take the whip away then?
I guess there was so much outcry, particularly in London, where the mayor is popular, that his hand was forced. And he's a very weak man. He's probably a bit like Johnson, believes that goes with what the last person who
blown in the wind
spoke to him said.
I like this analysis. I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, and it blows a hole in the idea that he forgot what he was supposed to say. The question becomes, why didn't he say anything? And the answer is anything that he said could have been taken down and used in evidence against you, which is what we kind of touched on yesterday, the question of what it was that 30p has done that Braverman hadn't done worse. And the only answer they've got is that he focused, as Peter reminds us, they focused on an individual. Anderson focused on an individual. He brought Sadiq Khan into it, which is clearly an attempt to claim that you can't trust Muslims, which is Islamophobic or anti-Muslim hatred, whatever you prefer. I'm not 100% comfortable with that distinction. I saw Kemi Badenoch trying to get it out there as well. Someone else who will be fighting with Suella Braverman for the support and loyalty of precisely the kind of people who will be privately agreeing, I think, with Lee Anderson at the moment. 10:41 is the time. I've got some phone lines free. 0345 60 973 is the number that you need. And we haven't, I don't think, heard from what you might describe as a traditional Tory supporter yet. But if you are in that category and you're watching what's unfolding now with a sense of befuddlement and incredulity, how do you account for what has happened? How have you ended up with a Minister for Illegal Immigration who, when reminded of a Conservative colleague losing the whip for the offence of... the offence of what? I would say the offence of Islamophobia, asked what it is that Lee Anderson did wrong, Michael Tomlinson cannot actually say so. Why not? Why can't he? 0345 6060 973. Chris is in Nottingham. Chris, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. So the problem for the Conservatives is they've spent all their time, they've bet the house on digging this giant hole to encourage racists to get in with them. And they know that that's the core voters that they've got left. It's all they've got left. And if they were to pinpoint Lee Anderson's comments as being Islamophobic, the fear is they will push those voters to reform. Then they're not scared of Labour. They know they're going to lose the next election. They're scared of how many seats Reform are going to take away from them.
They're not going to take seats. You mean they're going to give seats to Labour? They're not going to take.
Yeah, they're going to give seats. Yeah, they're going to reduce the amount of seats that they've got that they're going to have left. I don't think they're going to split. They're going to split the right wing. They're going to split the right wing vote, and the Tories, as you've explained, have somehow ended up completely surrendering anything that remotely resembles the centre ground. That's what you mean by the hole being dug. I don't understand that. It's probably got something to do with Brexit, but they have completely surrendered anything that looks like the centre ground to the Labour Party. Well, I think they've targeted this. They've decided they understand that they're going to be wiped out and they're going to have very few seats left. And Suella Braverman actually said it out loud in her resignation statement in the Commons. She said, "We face electoral oblivion," and she's not talking. She's talking about the Reform vote splitting the Conservatives to the point that Labour and
Labour's 20-point lead. Let's not overlook Labour's 20-point lead because it is pertinent to your analysis. Well, that then makes more of a mystery of the decision to take the whip away in the first place, as if Sunak's sort of trying to have his cake and eat it. We can get rid of. I mean, there might be a bit of snobbery involved, a bit of class-based prejudice involved on Sunak's part. We'll get rid of the one with the East Midlands accent, but we'll keep the one from the home counties, even though they've said more or less the same thing, and we'll just hope that nobody knows.
Oh, certainly. He's got to try and hoodwink a couple of traditional Tory voters that is actually sensible, but they're not going to pinpoint the actual offence itself for fear that they're going to push away this rump that that they've constantly been trying to placate with immigration and it's the politics of othering, and that's what they've tacked themselves to in order to just have something left, some presence left in the Commons after they get completely wiped out for being completely incompetent.
So they're just fighting over they're fighting over the same stinky votes that the party even further to the right than they are a fight. It is just odd, isn't it? I mean, doing A-levels in the future, this decision to tack ever further to the right, run out of people to other, because you took us out of the European Union, so you can't other the Poles anymore, or the Germans, or the French. And then you can't really other immigrants in general, because someone will turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, there are more people coming into this country from overseas than ever before, even after Brexit, and 14 years of you being in charge. So they can't really do that. So they have to actually go for British people. They have to try to other British people. That's usually where, in other countries, at other points in history, that's where anti-Semitism would come in. Jewish people live in constant fear of the spotlight coming back around, and a amoral demagogue or a political class desperate to protect itself from responsibility for its own disasters finds a helpful scapegoat, an entire community of people to scapegoat for their own problems. And historically, it's much, much, much more likely to happen to Jewish people than it is to Muslim people. But for reasons, the Tories are trying to malign all Muslims, which is probably why Anderson's gone and Braverman is still there, because she's accused Keir Starmer of being in hoc to Islamists, which is obviously disgusting and borderline libel. But he's not a Muslim. I think he's actually married to a Jewish woman, if such things matter. But Sadiq Khan is a Muslim. And so to accuse him of being mates with extremists is slightly different, maybe? I don't know. But is it different enough to provide any wiggle room for the likes of Michael Tomlinson when he's asked, what did Lee Anderson actually do wrong? Because it's bloody obvious. He suggested that Sadiq Khan can't be trusted because he's a Muslim, which is racist, or Islamophobic, or bigoted, or prejudiced, or, of course, quite possibly, all four. It's 10:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I've lost the text that pointed it out, my apologies, but you're right. Keir Starmer tomorrow could do a lot worse than channel Nick Ferrari at PMQs. I'm not sure who's going to be most shocked by that suggestion, Keir Starmer or Nick Ferrari. But to ask Rishi Sunak repeatedly, if he doesn't provide a neat answer immediately, what exactly did Lee Anderson do wrong that merited him losing the whip, and then asking why that doesn't apply to Suella Braverman. George puts it best, perhaps, from Manchester. Hi, James. Anderson was the sacrificial lamb thrown to the wolves to make it look like Sunak was standing up to racism, when everyone knows what Braverman said was 10 times worse. But because she has a lot of support from the right of the Tory party, the coward Sunak was too frightened to suspend her. I think there might be something in that, actually. I really do. How have the Tories got themselves into such a mess? And 30p Lee in particular, his outbursts, a few of you reminding me of that story from last week about one of the owners of GBBs, a man called Paul Marshall, whose Twitter account went private in September of last year, around the time he came under wider scrutiny because he wants to try to buy the Daily Telegraph. But it turned out that his Twitter account was full of likes of the kind of stuff that even Lee Anderson would fight shy of saying in public. It's, for example, a matter of time before civil war starts in Europe. The native European population is losing patience with fake refugee invaders. Funny, isn't it, that all these Brexiters now talk about the native European population, when 7 or 8 years ago, the native European population was far too foreign for us to have in this country. Isn't that... I've not noticed that before. It's the native European population now, is it, lads? Right, yeah. But they were far too foreign. Remember when they were speaking foreign on trains? Farage told us about it without mentioning that his then wife also spoke foreign at home to his half-German children. So, it's the native European population, is it now, that we need to protect? So why did we have to chuck him out back in 2016? It's a funny one, isn't it? He's also, and this may be, 30p Lee, agitating for a promotion at GBBs. He also shares, or certainly likes, views of people who promulgate the Great Replacement theory, which warns of the 4 stages of Islamic conquest. Now, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but I see a lot of this stuff on Twitter because the kind of people who subscribe to this sort of filth have I hope this doesn't sound conceited, they're a little bit obsessed with me. I mean, there are so few prominent liberal voices in the popular mainstream media, that those of us who've been lucky enough to achieve such a position come in from an inordinate and disproportionate amount of abuse and vitriol. So I see a lot of this stuff, but I never would have thought a Tory MP or a man trying to buy the Daily Telegraph or a funder of an apparently impartial television station would have been involved in the spread of it or the liking of it on social media. But there we are. It is 10:54. Brett's in Boreham Wood. Brett, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Well, I'm not your demographic. I'm a Tory councillor in Radler, actually, from Boreham Wood.
I thought
you were looking for a Tory voice.
There is. I do not have a demographic, Brett. We deal only in principles and facts on this programme. So I'm sure you are my demographic.
Okay, well, my point is, Lee Anderson was wrong in what he said. He was trying to take something, he was using something that Sadiq Khan said in 2017 about moderate Muslims and trying to turn that into something else. He was wrong in saying that. The problem I have with this whole conversation is anti-Semitism as a Jew. Now, what has happened in this conversation, we started with Big Ben projecting what I believe and what 90% of Jewish people believe is a genocidal chant from the river to the sea.
Except when Benjamin Netanyahu puts it in election material.
Yeah, I understand that. Again, I understand that. But I think at the same time, he's doing that as a response to what he's hearing in...
But he's literally... I've seen him holding up a map which has Israel extending from the river to the sea and making it clear that that's his ambition.
Benjamin Netanyahu would likely get taken out, will likely get voted out at the next election. So we'll see.
But he's not, though, is he? He's currently the Prime Minister of Israel. I mean, I take your point, and I believe that you're making the point in good faith, but you can't just gloss over the fact that the man who's currently leading the attack on Gaza routinely deploys the notion of from the river to the sea as an electoral lever.
Again, I don't want to talk about Gaza. I want to talk about...
Well, you have to, because the reason that phrase was projected onto the Elizabeth Tower was precisely because of what's happening in Gaza.
Well, look...
So you can't talk about one without the other,
well,
Brett.
If you want to talk about Gaza...
I don't particularly. I want to talk about Lee Anderson. You brought Gaza into it. I'm not quite sure why.
Okay. Can we start again? So
yeah, of course we can.
We've got a projection of from the river to the sea, which 90%...
No, but we're talking about Gaza now.
You're talking over me. You're talking about over me, okay? 90% of Jews...
I'm sorry, I am going to talk over you if you say things that are disingenuous. You said we were going to start over and not talk about Gaza.
But it's... Okay, 90% of Jews believe that chant is anti-Semitic.
Except when Benjamin Netanyahu uses it.
Now, again, I'm trying to talk about anti-Semitism, and you're just trying to talk over it to talk about...
No, I'm not, Brett. I'm trying to point out to you what everybody listening hears. They hear you saying that those words are toxic, but not acknowledging the fact that they're used by Israeli politicians quite regularly.
There are some toxic Israeli politicians. I'm not denying that.
In charge.
At all. In charge. But
and currently overseeing the attack upon the Palestinian people in Gaza, which is what the protests...
It's not an attack on the Palestinian people, it's an attack on Hamas. And please do not conflate the two. It's an attack on the Hamas terrorist
Mate, the death toll conflates the two.
Well, okay, so let's say 30,000 people. Okay, let's talk about the death toll.
Well, I wanted to talk about Lee Anderson.
James, 1 second, because you wanted to bring this up. 30,000 was talked about in British Parliament plenty of times. That's an inflated number from Hamas. Hamas was at 28,000. Now let's take 11,000 off that. Let's call them terrorists, okay? So we're left with...
Where does that number come from?
So you think all 29,000 are...
No, I don't know what I think. I'm asking you what you think. Where does that number come from?
I would say that when the IDF and Israel have announced that it's 10 or 11,000 combatants are being killed, that's quite a...
Okay, just checking number. On your sort. Well, it's not verifiable. I've checked. They have said that, and it may be true. But why are we having this conversation when we're talking about the Tories' problem with Islamophobia?
All I said was I believe, and many Jews believe, from the river to the sea is a genocidal.
But I have to now repeat, except when Benjamin Netanyahu says it.
That's in response. Okay, can we just talk about what?
Well, it doesn't work like that, Brett. You say things, I respond to them.
Okay. Can you let me carry on my conversation?
Well, is it going to involve Lee Anderson and the Conservative Party at any point?
I won't repeat that. So, he was wrong, okay, in saying what he did. But now the conversation has turned to Islamophobia, okay? Any criticism of anything Islam-related is now Islamophobia.
No, that's not true.
Wait, I want to carry on.
Well, you can't say things that aren't true, Brett.
Now we've forgotten, James, about the anti-Semitism, which is absolutely rife vile and very, very threatening to the Jewish community. Okay, synagogues are being hounded. Jewish schools, okay, are under threat as well. It's a completely different sort of thing. If you look at the population of Jewish people in the UK, it's 270,000, something thereabouts. Population of Muslims in the UK is 4 million. If you look at the number of incidents of hate crimes between the two religions, they are round about the same, which shows that they're both awful. Of course, anti-Muslim hatred is awful. However, it is incredibly prevalent within, and pretty much 1,000 times more prevalent within the population of Jews. Now, what I'm saying is now we're having this whole conversation about one MP out of 650 who may have said something pretty damn silly, but we've now moved the whole conversation away from anti-Semitism. And how
but Brett, can I speak now?
James,
no, you carry on.
There are a number of mosques in the UK. Okay, I am certainly not an Islamophobe. I'm not anti-Muslim, but I'm worried about the prevalence of anti-Semitism within Islam in mosques in the UK.
Okay, here's the thing. So am I. Okay, I'm also worried about the prevalence of Islamophobia, and I think that we probably rightly, given the statistics that you described, spend a lot more time talking about anti-Semitism than we do about Islamophobia. But the reason why this conversation is, I mean, you must understand this, Brett. The reason why this conversation is unfolding in the way that it is on this day is as a direct consequence of a former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party indulging in base Islamophobia. And the fact that you don't want that conversation to be had is just a little odd. I would say to you that both conversations can be held. Why do you want to close one of them down?
I don't. I just
well,
feel
you did.
that
You've literally phoned in to object to the fact that we're talking about Islamophobia, Brett, and that's just weird.
I think no, it's not weird. And stop taking things out of context, James.
I'm not, mate. Everyone's heard the conversation, Brett. Everyone's heard exactly what you said. That is, you rang in to complain that we were talking about Islamophobia.
Well, because of my reasons. We were having a proper conversation about anti-Semitism, how to stop it.
Yes, and today we're having a conversation about Islamophobia. Why can't we do both?
UK, Western people in the UK cannot raise anti-Semitism without raising Islamophobia at the same time.
That's not true.
The two have to be mutually
That's not
exclusive.
true.
Yes,
we spoke for the duration of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party about the anti-Semitism
because it was horrendously rampant.
Yes, but you can't keep contradicting. You can't keep contradicting yourself. You just said we can't talk about it without bringing Islamophobia into it. I'm reminding you that we can, we do, and we did. So in a couple of sentences, I need a couple of things from you. In a couple of sentences, who do we get permission from to have a conversation about Islamophobia?
And of course we can have a conversation about Islamophobia.
Thank you. And the second thing is, which currently serving MP would you say stood comparison with Lee Anderson for anti-Semitism that you could compare to any party that you could compare, and be aware of libel laws, that you could compare to what Lee Anderson and Suella Braverman are now saying about Muslims?
Well, I could say that about Muslims.
No, someone who's a serving MP whose anti-Semitism is of a piece with the Islamophobia displayed by Lee Anderson and Suella Braverman.
Oh, I think there's many within the Labour Party still, all the Green parties, many.
But don't have any MPs.
Within the Labour Party,
then,
there are many.
Who?
Well, Dawn Butler.
Okay, you're accusing Dawn Butler of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, easily.
Okay, and your evidence?
Some of the things that she says online.
Go on.
Absolutely. Look, I think for Jewish people,
you need to give me the evidence now, Brett. Respectfully, you need to give us the evidence now.
Well, I can't just read something. I'm on the phone to you. I can't just read something.
But you've literally just accused an MP of anti-Semitism. You can't then say I don't have any evidence.
Well, she's in the same boat as Jeremy Corbyn, so pretty much anything that Jeremy Corbyn
the evidence,
has said...
The evidence?
Like I just said, she is basically...
Jeremy Corbyn's not a Labour MP. Dawn Butler is.
Okay.
So, Brett, the evidence? You're a Conservative councillor accusing a Labour MP of anti-Semitism on national radio, and all I'm asking you for is your evidence, mate.
You're talking about Lee Anderson as a previous deputy chair of the party.
Yes.
I'm talking about Jeremy Corbyn as a previous leader.
No. I said serving MP for a reason, because Keir Starmer has got rid of Jeremy Corbyn. He is tackling anti-Semitism in a way that Rishi Sunak is not tackling Islamophobia. So just once more, in case our lawyers are listening, The evidence that Dawn Butler is anti-Semitic.
Absolutely bang out of order.
The
James.
evidence.
And you should be called out for this.
The evidence.
You're trying to put me into a trap.
No, I asked you a question to which you could have said, I can't think of anyone.
Have a libel, and I think it's disgusting.
Yes, well, I think the evidence is viewed.
Through you. Your listeners see through you.
I'm sure they do, Brett, but in conclusion, the evidence, please.
I just said it's the same thing as Diane Abbott. You know, do you want evidence of Diane Abbott and some of the stupid things that she said?
Not stupid, anti-Semitic from Dawn Butler.
Gingers received the
from
same
Dawn
thing as
Butler.
Oh, okay. I don't have my phone on me to be able to read through Twitter, but she has said.
But I don't have my phone on me to be able to read through Twitter. But I can tell you what Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson have said that's Islamophobic.
Because they are always in the news at the moment because you're pushing that agenda. Because that's exactly what
pushing that agenda. That's an interesting trope. What do you mean by that?
You are a funny man, James O'Brien, because you're
a Conservative councillor, Brett, in Boreham Wood.
Yes, and
accusing politicians of anti-Semitism without any evidence whatsoever.
No, I'll go through Twitter in a minute, shall I? As soon as I got off this call.
Yeah, if you want, mate.
Honestly, I think you're incredibly patronising.
It's not my fault you've come on the radio and made a fool of yourself.
All I've come on is to talk about the Jewish population.
You've come on to complain that we're having a conversation about Islamophobia, and you've ended up accusing Dawn Butler of anti-Semitism without any evidence whatsoever.
You put me in a box, James. You put me in a box.
You put yourself in a box, Brett.
Purposely showing that you've got absolute contempt for the Jewish population.
So you're accusing me of anti-Semitism now?
Oh, I said contempt. Contempt, not anti-Semitism.
What's the difference?
Well, there is a difference.
What is it?
Well, you haven't said any words that are anti-Jewish hate. However, you're pushing this argument.
So what's the evidence for my contempt for Jewish people then?
Who came on this call?
What's your evidence for my contempt for Jewish people?
UK, to talk about anti-Semitism in the UK.
No, you phoned a phone in about Islamophobia.
Some sort of problem.
You phoned a phone in about Islamophobia. What's your evidence for my contempt for Jewish people, Brett? I take this quite seriously, actually. I think much of your call has been ridiculous, but I take this very seriously. What's your evidence?
Because you're trying to turn my conversation away from me talking about how Jews feel in the UK at the moment.
It's a conversation about Islamophobia. You phoned in to complain that we were having it. Now tell me what your evidence is for my contempt for Jewish people, Brett.
Because, do you know what? If I start raising some things like about issues with anti-Semitism in mosques, you're still trying to push me.
No, we're talking about my contempt for Jewish people. Give me some proof.
Because the fact that I've just come on this show as a heartfelt trying to ensure that the Jewish population gets a voice in all of this, instead of turning the conversation specifically to Islamophobia, which is a very...
So by talking about Islamophobia, I'm displaying contempt for the Jewish people, Brett?
No, the fact that you, instead of just listening and having empathy to what I've had to say...
I have empathy for some of the things that you've described, but I pick you up on things that are challengeable. Once again, your evidence of my contempt for the Jewish people, apart from the fact that I've been talking about anti-Muslim hatred today.
But do you know what? It'd be worth going on YouGov, doing a poll about the Jewish population, what they think of yourself at this very present moment.
I'd ask you again, what's your evidence for my contempt for Jewish people, Brett? That's a very serious allegation that you've made.
Think of James O'Brien at the moment.
Yeah, I look forward to it. But in the meantime, your evidence, please.
I've just told you.
No, you haven't.
I've just told you that I've come on this show to have a conversation about anti-Semitism being taken away.
But it's a phone-in about Islamophobia.
No, because this all started with Big Ben.
This started with Lee Anderson losing the whip for being Islamophobic, and the question I've asked about 14 times since 10 o'clock this morning is how have the Conservative Party got themselves into such a mess over Islamophobia? But I'd ask you, Brett, the question that remains, and we're going to have to call it a day soon, is your evidence, please, for my contempt for Jewish people. Because ridiculous though you are, I do find that hurtful and offensive.
And there we go. You just called me ridiculous.
Well,
okay?
prove me wrong by giving me the evidence. Prove me wrong by giving me the evidence.
I'm just trying to have a decent, empathetic...
No, you accuse me of contempt for Jewish people. That's neither decent nor empathetic.
You're dealing with me. It's just a perfect example of patronising.
Where's your evidence?
Population. Oh my God! It's like I don't know. Sometimes I don't even know why I listen to you. Sometimes.
Where's your evidence?
I've just told you. You turned me coming on your show to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism.
On the contrary, Brett.
Me being ridiculous.
On the contrary, you rang in to complain that we were having a phone-in about Islamophobia. You've ended up accusing Dawn Butler of anti-Semitism and me of contempt for the Jewish people.
Well, do you know
Have a great day, Brett. It's 11:08.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12 minutes after 11 is the time, which is a somewhat tardy return from the news, even by my news-crashing standards. Thoughts and prayers for Keith, please. Coming up next, we will turn our attention to the front page of The Times, which I think is perhaps a slightly more nuanced statement than first impressions allow. Rishi Sunak has declared that he is living proof that Britain is not a racist country, as he sought to contain a growing row over Islamophobia, is the conclusion of that sentence. I think that a lot of progressive people in this country are under a bit of an illusion about what other countries are like, apart from flare-ups like the one we've seen this week, or indeed the very real and present horror of anti-Semitism that our last caller referred to. To suggest that there is no racism here is ridiculous. But that's not quite the same as saying that Britain is not a racist country. So I'm not really minded to ask you another why question. Why has Rishi Sunak done this? But I am minded to ask you, what difference does class make to your understanding of racism? So it's a conversation I've actually wanted to have for ages, and Rishi Sunak is an almost perfect way into it. I didn't really understand racism in this country until I got this job. I didn't really know enough. I certainly had no real understanding or experience of it. And I don't think, looking back, that is because of my ethnicity. I think it's because of my class. You know, I don't want to sound silly, but I have a diverse friendship group, and within it, we don't experience these sort of things. People tell me about things that they've experienced in their youth or things that they experience in other contexts. I had one friend of Sri Lankan extraction who had so many unpleasant experiences in his youth that he didn't like going into pubs, even much, much later in life. So I just wonder whether today would be a good day upon which to have a little look at the difference that class makes. So when Rishi Sunak says he is proof, living proof, that Britain is not a racist country, is it only because he went to public school and mixes in quite privileged circles that he can say that? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And I would have thought that the anti-Semitism question, I'd rather not take more calls complaining that we're not talking about anti-Semitism and we are talking about Islamophobia, if that's all right with you. But actually, anti-Semitism is racism. And, you know, the suggestion that Britain is not a racist country presumably would cause some raised eyebrows in corners of the country that are currently dealing with the anti-Semitism that our last caller described. So what do you think Sunak has done here? Why do you think he's done it? And how big a role do you think class and privilege play in perceptions of racism? It's 11:15.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
18 minutes after 11 is the time. It's what are we doing? We're defying the old rule about dinner parties. Never talk about class, race, or politics at dinner, and religion. Good God, we really are going for the full set. Sometimes a headline really takes my breath away. I saw one. I'm pretty sure I remember this correctly. I saw one involving Rishi Sunak saying that he believed that the P word was never deployed anymore in public. I hope I haven't misremembered that. I probably should have checked. And I just thought, I think that's a mark of privilege rather than experience. I'm fascinated by privilege, largely because if you've enjoyed it, you often don't notice. You often don't know. You know, when we have phone-ins about private education and parents ring in and say, well, I work bloody hard to send my children to private school, as if they don't realise that even to be in a position to send a child to private school, you're already both statistically and materially privileged. I used to do that because you only know the world you inhabit, right? Unless you're lucky enough to tune into a show like this today or even more lucky enough to present it. But I used to do that because when I was growing up, I was very conscious of the things we didn't have. Dad had a company car, so you know it was never going to stand comparison with wealthier friends whose dads had Range Rovers and Jaguars. But I realise now that there was so little money left over after our school fees had been paid that we didn't have the sort of holidays that a lot of our friends had. And we didn't have a lot of the accoutrements and luxuries that some of our friends had. For mum and dad, it was a huge priority. And I used to think that that was a counterpoint to the privilege question. I honestly, I probably didn't know the statistics as a kid, but I would have said, had I had a radio show at the age of 11, I would have said, no, you don't understand. My parents choose to send me to that school, and your parents choose to go to Barbados every year. One isn't better than the other, and one isn't right and one isn't wrong, because that was all that I knew. That was all that I knew. And privilege is something that you don't really want to acknowledge because that involves an admission of benefiting from unfairness. I'm speaking from my own perspective now. I'm trying to work out where I come from and why I held and possibly still hold views that I have. You don't want to admit that you've benefited from unfairness. I've got to tell you something. When you do admit it, it's incredibly liberating. I would love to believe. I'm very happy with the way my career has panned out, right? I'm not going to lie to you about that. There were a few years, maybe a decade ago, I was thinking, I wish I could do a bit more. I wish this had gone a bit better. Right now, 21 minutes after 11, Tuesday, February the 27th, 2024, I am one of those people who could be called fulfilled. And that is an incredible blessing. I don't know how many people it applies to. I envy people who can achieve fulfillment without the material success or the status that I still sadly value. But I am fulfilled. I have enough in life. And I wish I could look myself and you in the eye and say that if I hadn't had the education and the advantages that I had, I would still have achieved this level. But I wouldn't have done. I cannot kid myself, and it would be rude of me to kid you. And it's quite liberating. It's. I remember a great story that Charlton Heston told on the Wogan programme about serendipity, and this was before Charlton Heston made his speech at the NRA about having to prize guns out of his cold dead hand. He was leaning out of a car on the MGM lot, and I think Samuel Goldwyn was looking out of the door of his office. And at the time, they were looking to cast Ben-Hur. And as Charlton Heston told the story, it somehow involved him leaning out of his car window to wave goodbye to a security guard. And in that moment, apparently, Sammy Goldwyn saw Ben-Hur. The car became the chariot, and Heston became the character that he would play, and it would change his life. And you have to acknowledge these things, not just the moments of serendipity, but also the privilege. And I think that if I hadn't done this job for the last 20 years, my understanding of racism would be very, very different from what it is. There's a story yesterday about a black man essentially being told he wasn't allowed to buy paint in an art supplies shop because they are on guard for potential graffiti artists. He was with his son. That would not happen to me if I was with my child and I went into an art supply shop and sought to buy some spray paint to fix up the garden gate or whatever it might. The suspicion that I was a graffiti artist, which isn't a particularly black pastime, but nevertheless, the staff in the shop, the story, as it was reported, was obviously evidence of prejudice. So the relationship between class and racism, I'm going to put it to you that Rishi Sunak lives in sections of society where racism is actually rife, but he doesn't feel a victim of it himself. It's the I don't mean you school of racism. If you have had a very privileged upbringing, if you are posh or wealthy or both, I wonder whether your understanding of racism can ever be the same as it would be if you had grown up in less privileged circles. Just for the record, I want to make it absolutely clear, and the current iteration of the Tory party proves it beyond all doubt, racism is absolutely some of the biggest racists I've ever met are posh. You know, an awful lot of them have inherited huge amounts of money, which, of course, plays back into that idea of never wanting to admit that you've enjoyed an unfair advantage. So I mean, I'm baffled by elements of what Sunak has said, but I do think at least some of it can be explained by the question of class and or wealth. But I think I need people better versed than I am in the relationship between these three factors to explain to me from your side of this conversation how pertinent you think my point is. It's 11:25. Isaac's in Westminster. Isaac, what would you like to say?
Hi. I believe that class, there is an issue with class and racism, and I feel like I personally experienced this.
Go on.
I went to Ampleforth as well.
Did you?
Yes, and I also went to Newcastle University. And I noticed that because I'm mixed race and half Caribbean and half white working class, I noticed that whenever there was an ethnic minority, that if it was a South Asian individual, they were usually always from India, right. very wealthy. And if they were from Africa, they were usually from either Nigeria or Ghana. And I noticed that these nations or these kind of individuals were usually accepted. And when I went there,
even at school, Isaac.
Yes, even at
school. I'm sorry to hear that. That wasn't. I mean, you've proved my point. Do you know what I nearly said then?
What?
I nearly said that wasn't my experience, but that's the whole bloody point, isn't it? It wouldn't be my experience. I'm sorry to hear that, though. We were there at very different times, I think. You sound much younger than me.
Yeah. Okay. And I just noticed that the experience of these ethnic minorities, the Nigerians and Indians, was very different to the experience that my family were having, who never got the chance to go to university or
and that was because not because of the colour of your skin, but because it was like an extra dimension of discrimination based upon your socio-economic situation.
Yes, it seemed to me that certain subsections of different ethnicities seem to have it worse off. So it seemed to me that a lot of Caribbean people, a lot of Pakistani people who were less well off didn't seem to get into these institutions because they weren't well connected or didn't have the money, and therefore they were, I guess, subject to a lot more racism outside of these circles. So I do believe that Rishi Sunak kind of fits into that very thin stratum of society where the ethnic minority does end up with a lot of wealth and getting into certain educational establishments and therefore rising up the ranks and managing to become prime minister.
So it's money that you're describing as a, what's the word we're looking for? Money as a camouflage or an insulator?
I think it's a factor in managing to sort of integrate into these, wealthy white circles that they are happy to sort of welcome you in as long as there's a lot of money there. And it seems to me that just my experience from going to university is that there was never any Caribbean people in the university. There was never any Pakistani people in the university, and the experiences that those groups were going through were always outside the universities, at state schools or community colleges, and they always seemed to be subject to racism. And if, like for example, a Caribbean ever got in, which I did, I was never accepted even by the ethnic minorities that were there, because I wasn't African. So,
in what way, if you don't mind me asking, if I was to ask for sort of an example of what you're describing beyond the description, what would you offer?
Well, for example, when I was at boarding school, I was called the N-word. I was told to go back to the Congo, even though I'm not from Africa. And whenever I tried to sort of seek friendship in the sort of group of ethnic minorities, I was always shunned because of this old...
because you were perceived as being poor.
I was perceived as being poor, and also a sort of snobbery around not being wealthy, not being African, not being from that that kind of.
This is a really clear depiction of a hierarchy of racism in which class and wealth are huge factors. I'm really sorry, Isaac, to hear you tell me that. I don't hold much affection for the institution that we both attended, but my memories are nicer than yours, even though I ended up getting chucked out, and I presume you didn't. That's really made me sad today, to think that you were having to put up with stuff like that in the same corridors that I used to walk down without a care in the world.
Thank you.
Right, you take care. You take care. It is 11:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:34 is the time. In some ways, it's the most interesting, or it can provide the most interesting conversations that we have. And I'm speaking as a listener now, not a presenter. The calls that help me understand things I would never be able to properly understand in the course of my daily life. But I have to tell you that Isaac's knocked me back a bit. If you got a bit confused about some elements of that conversation, we went to the same school. Neither of us would have been among the wealthiest of classmates there, but I think from the way Isaac told the story, my family background would have been a little more comfortable than his. And by dint of being mixed race and not wealthy, his contention was that his experience was very, very different from what it would have been had he been from either a different ethnic minority or with more money. And that's why the conversation about class and race today is happening. And indeed, it's why I am so intrigued by Rishi Sunak's declaration that he's living proof Britain is not a racist country, because he could become Prime Minister. And yet I think most people agree. The reason why Liz Truss beat him in his first attempt to become Prime Minister was probably because, in part, of his heritage. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. Sarah is in Crystal Palace. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hey James, how are you?
Sarah. I'm very well.
Hiya. Good. Okay, I wanted to just speak about my perspective as parenting my stepson. Do go to quite a posh school in Dulwich, I won't name it.
Okay. And there are a few, actually, so I don't think you've given the game away by saying that out loud.
I know that, yeah. And honestly, I was blown away. When he was about 7, him and I were watching a David Olusoga documentary, and he had heard some words and said, I've been called that. What does that mean?
Oh, wow.
And I couldn't believe it. And I kicked up a big stink. He's my stepson, so I maybe crossed the line by sending emails to the school. I wanted to speak to his teacher about it. Myself and my fiance got involved at that point, and his teacher said, yeah, Josh did tell me that these kids said that, but, you know, it was almost boys will be boys.
Was it the N-word? Or?
It was the N-word. And then he had told me about other comments and that, and they don't really let me play football with them. And it's fine, they're just silly. And I just couldn't. And he didn't really understand racism at that point. But fast forward 3 years, he's now 10.
Yes.
Some incidents still happen. And the reason I relate it back to class, James, is because when my fiance's family, all of their children have been through these sorts of schools as well, slightly older, and they always say, don't rock the boat, as if we're privileged to be in these positions, and that really the race thing where it's problematic in your life is for the lower class, whereas this is just boys being boys or boys being silly. And I just think it's quite a blinkered, I just think that...
No, I hear you.
No, do you hear me? So
yes, I do.
The race and the class thing is not, you know?
Not what?
It doesn't coincide. It's just like it's separate. But I think it really does. And I have made a decision. I've met you with my toddler at a book signing.
Oh, yeah.
And I've made a decision that he won't be going to those environments. And you talk about private schools a lot, but it's exactly that identity thing that I think Rishi Sunak suffers from. Suella Braverman.
I think they're more. I think possibly, and Isaac's call has, as you can probably tell, really resonated with me. Similar experiences to what you described, but in his case, at my old school, I think things have become more snobbish since. Partly because the fees are so much more than they used to be. The schools used to be within reach for families like mine. They would not be now. Not for my mum and dad. And with that enhanced privilege comes more snobbery. Absolutely. And possibly when that prejudice is commonplace, then other prejudices flourish. You know, you smuggle in the racism under under the cloak of snobbery or wealth-based snobbery. What are you going to do? I mean, you don't need to tell me your family business.
I'm not. I'm going to, and it's against the family's wishes. But I will be sending him to a state school and try and do the extra tuition just so they feel like, that privilege that he could have, you're not giving it to him. I just want to prove that it can be done, but I don't want him to suffer the same identity crisis where this is happening. Like the other day we were driving through Brixton. We are from the working class. And he said, my stepson said, why are black people so aggressive? Gosh. And it broke my heart. You're not around other black people who are not in the same class that we have now worked up to be, but this is the impression you get, and I wonder what you hear at school. Ooh. And it really stresses me out.
I bet it does. I wish I had something constructive to say, but I don't, because there are some serious challenges there that nobody really can, I don't think, nobody can kind of advise on those difficulties. And you do then, of course, find yourself wondering whether Rishi Sunak recognises the reality of his own existence, never mind the existence of other people. Sarah, thank you. It's 11:39. Archana is in Walthamstow. Archana, what would you like to say?
Yeah, a lot of what you just said really resonated with me regarding how Rishi Sunak perceives himself. So I'm of Indian background. My dad was a doctor, so a fairly middle-class existence, living in a middle-class area. Yes. Went to a private school, and all my friends were white growing up. All my friends at university were white, and I just don't think I was even aware of being Indian, except at home. Right. And it's really interesting because my kids are mixed race, and I think the children today are much, much more aware of, a multicultural. They go to state school, a very, very multicultural area, as Walthamstow is. And I just think I didn't see myself as Indian particularly growing up. So I didn't. Well,
that is good and bad, right?
Yes, it is. Now that I've got children of my own and I want them to be aware of my culture, I think I've become a lot more aware of it since moving to London. I grew up in Nottingham. Right. And so, I did I felt like I was really cushioned from very direct racism, just because I guess the circles I moved in, it sounds weird to say it, but I was a bit of a novelty.
Well, you were a doctor's daughter as well. So, I mean, Isaac and Sarah would both suggest that if you had been of an Afro-Caribbean background, your experience might have been different, even in the rarefied circles that you all inhabited.
And I didn't really mix with people from Africa or the Caribbean either. Sure. Because they weren't in my circles either. And there is quite a lot of racism with Asian people against black people as well.
Yes, of course. It's well documented. So, I mean, oddly, I think it's probably a white person's problem to think that you can separate the two. But actually, class and ethnicity, when it comes to prejudice, are knitted together about as tightly as it's possible to imagine.
Yeah, because people that, when I sort of moved to London, I met more, people that were working class, mixed race, etc. And the sort of the issues they had growing up, due to where they lived, the areas they lived in, working class areas, and they suffered more than I did.
And your children now, are they compared to you at their age?
Well, they're mixed race, so it's a slightly different sort of family life. My husband's white working class, I'm brown middle class. Gosh. So we've got a bit of a mix. And I just think also their social circles are much more varied as well, due to living in London probably. Yeah, that probably makes a difference, doesn't it? And that idea of multiculturalism being a lot more commonplace in our big cities. Thank you. This is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? It is for me at least, because my callers are speaking about something that to them is blindingly obvious, and yet for me this is something of an education, up to and including this. Scott in Rochester says, I'd love to know why the previous caller's experience at your old school was a surprise and knocked you back. Classism and racism in one of the UK's best private schools would surely have been prevalent. Hand on heart, Scott, it really wasn't. Well, except that I got a bit of anti-Irish stuff at prep school when the IRA were in their pomp and people sought to malign all Irish people as terrorists or terrorist sympathisers, which I suppose takes us back to 30p Lee's comments about Muslims. But I'm pretty sure that at big school, at public school, I never came across
Well, do you know what? There was a lad of Indian extraction and a lad of Chinese extraction in my house in my year, and I can't speak for them, can I? I can't say that they didn't experience anything. All I know is that I didn't do it, and I wasn't there when it did happen, if it did. So that's why I'm shocked, Scott. There's no biggie. Hasib is in Leighton. Hasib, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Firstly, I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you trying to understand everybody's points of view and their stories. What you were saying about, what Rishi Sunak said about the P word, my friend got called the P word literally in traffic last week. Yeah. I don't think it's something that's gone.
No, but it wouldn't have happened if he'd been in a helicopter.
Oh, of course not. Of course not. I was saying to the lady that answered the phone that I don't see Rishi Sunak as a representative. I am a British Asian.
Right.
But it's mainly because I'm middle working class. Privilege and class has a big thing to do with it, in my opinion. Even just when I went to university, I went to University of Westminster, which I picked because of how diverse I thought it was. And it was. But the course that I chose didn't turn out to be so diverse.
Really?
So I did architecture, and my whole campus was very diverse. But when I went to the fourth floor where architecture was, there was definitely a difference in class, and
there would be, wouldn't there? I think. And that. You see, I remember when Nihal talked about walking into a room at the BBC that was full of white people, which I thought was just a perfectly natural thing to note and explain. And he took a right old kicking on social media. So I asked the question sensitively. That matters to you because so you walk into a room and you feel different from everybody else in the room, and that is obviously significant to you.
It's definitely an uncomfortable feeling.
Okay.
I can't describe it to you. You probably won't be able to understand it completely, but it's definitely an uncomfortable position to be in. I don't think I'm wrong for saying that either. It's just there's certain looks that you get, maybe certain comments.
And if you'd been from a much wealthier background, would the experience have been different?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. I do too now. I don't know that I would have done it 11 o'clock today, but I think I do too now. And that's why. And in fact, Sangeeta did a phone-in on this, which I must have missed. But what Sunak said was that he was very hurt when he heard his siblings being described in the way that your friend was described in traffic the other day, but that he didn't think it would ever happen to his children. And actually, if his children are moving in much more rarefied circles than he did, he might be right. His children might not experience this kind of thing. Yeah. But to suggest that means it's not out there anymore is a bit silly, isn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely. I think there is an underlying racism there. It's just a lot of people, I feel like, have this outer persona of I'm woke now and I'm not racist and everything. But there's definitely when you're a bit annoyed or peed off in traffic and someone cuts you off or something, then it might just
they reach for the thing that they think will hurt you.
Exactly.
So it's a bit like the schoolyard. It could be wearing spectacles or being a bit overweight. It's the thing, and in a country where I do believe, and as a white man, I don't know how helpful it is for me to say this or how qualified I am to say it, but I do pay quite a lot of attention, and it is a much more welcoming stroke tolerant country, even with the current iteration of the Tory party doing their best to slap us into reverse, than many other comparable countries. But it would still be something that the difference from the majority is the thing that you can lampoon somebody for. So I think that the traffic experience is really pertinent, actually. And I'm obviously sorry for what your mate experienced. So, Steve, take care. It's 11:48.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:51 is the time. It's not, there are plenty of opportunities, and you will appreciate that I normally avail myself of them, but I'm not having a big swing at Rishi Sunak over this story. I'm just intrigued as to how his experience, how his opinion can be so different from other people's. He has declared that he is living proof that Britain is not a racist country. This is as part of his attempts to contain a growing row in his party over Islamophobia. And it just occurred to me, for a couple of reasons, things I've been mulling over in slightly different contexts, it just occurred to me that that's probably got more to do with his class than anything else, or his privilege and his wealth. You always remember that clip, and I don't know that it's fair. I'm sure I said things when I was 18 that I wouldn't want necessarily to be broadcast every week today, but there was a documentary he took part in, I think as a sixth former, when he said, with his doting father looking on, he said something like, well, I have upper-class friends, I have middle-class friends, and I have working-class friends. And then there's a pause, bless him. And I maybe not working-class friends. And it just occurred to me that the experience of racism is probably very, very different according to your socioeconomic status. And, it turns out not only was I right, but I was, for many people, stating the bleeding obvious. But I still find it fascinating. Adam's in Hornchurch. Adam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm a first-time caller to yourself, a big supporter.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to talk through my experiences. It's interesting you mentioned that interview with Rishi. I'm a British Pakistani Muslim, and I think that I've sort of experienced both sides. And you said that interview about working class, upper class, middle class is going to sound like I'm repeating him, but I do have friends from all those things, so all those I suppose parts of society. My dad's a GP, he's a retired GP now, but when he came to the country from Pakistan, they were living in abject poverty up in Manchester, and he came, very, very working class family. His dad used to work in the factories, textile factories. He managed to get himself a good education and become a GP. So then we've obviously grown up with privilege, but just walking through my background experiences really. So primary school was a state school.
Right.
Secondary school was a top grammar school in Essex, one of the top ranking ones at the time. My siblings went to grammar schools as well. They weren't fee paying, but
sure.
You've got
they're selective in they're equally selective in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. But then going through my sort of experiences from that, I've experienced racism in primary school, especially as people sort of got older. I think they're quite innocent when they're sort of kids, and as they get older, it comes out. I've been called the P word on many occasions. At secondary school, in a grammar school setting, maybe sort of less of the racism around the sort of P word and things like that being thrown around. But then things really exploded when you had the sort of new sort of war on terror, sort of 2000 onwards after sort of 9/11, especially the 7/7 attacks. And then everyone just starts calling you, a terrorist and this and that. And they start, doing...
How hurtful was it?
Very, very hurtful. And people used to do it to, really sort of get under your skin. But I wanted to just mention, I'm sort of flying through everything at the moment, but I just wanted to mention about Rishi saying that he, hasn't experienced any form of racism. And I believe
not quite that. I think he said his siblings did when they were young, but he doesn't believe his daughters would now, and that he is living proof that Britain is not a racist country.
Yeah, absolutely wrong. So where I've had a range of different jobs sort of growing up. When I was a student at uni, I worked in McDonald's, I worked in a chicken shop getting minimum wage cash in hand. Yeah. I've worked in the city in finance, insurance. I set up a property company abroad using my parents' funds. Like I've done loads of different things.
Yeah, you have.
I suppose if you want to call them working class jobs to sort of really upper class investment jobs and things. And I am treated completely differently. So for me, I've personally experienced it. If I'm looking rough working in a sort of chicken shop with other people who are, sort of, I suppose, newly sort of migrated over to the country, people treat me the exact same. Whereas if I go to a sort of, a lovely sit down sort of restaurant in a Michelin-starred restaurant or whatever with potential investors, I'm treated completely differently, and I think that that's because people see you as an asset because there's some kind of financial gain.
So the point, So what
kind of connection?
But the same people would. I mean, because I genuinely have encountered more. It might be just because of the circles I mix in, but I've encountered way more prejudice and racism among people I would call privileged. But they will talk differently in front of me, and they won't be talking about you. They will be talking about people from different social circles of your ethnicity. They'll be talking. I mean, I don't know how much you were listening after Brexit, but the number of calls we got from people whose own family had voted to leave because of immigration, and they would turn around to them and say, "Oh, I don't mean you." That's roughly what we're talking about here. That the I don't mean you syndrome, isn't it?
That's right.
I have generalised prejudices towards people like you, but I don't mean you because you're worth a few quid, or I don't mean you because you're wearing a smart suit, or I don't mean you because of the car that you drive.
Yeah, I've been told to my face you're one of the good ones, aren't you? I live in Hornchurch. You've got Romford right next door, if you can imagine. Yeah. My school was right in the sort of, deep into Essex. And the sort of people that you meet everywhere around Essex and everywhere around sort of the East End as well, you'll meet a mixture of people. I've been told, I'm one of the good ones, and I'm not like them. And my dad's spoken about his experience growing up,
which would have been very different,
70s, which was horrible. And I just think, well, what's really sort of changed? We've come a long way. I think the younger generation are much more tolerant and open, but you've got the older generation who are the ones who hold all the wealth. So they've got those views.
The gate, and probably an element of gatekeeping as well. There is. You said something quite uplifting there. Obviously, you knew it was uplifting when you talk about the younger generation. It's an area in which the UK is kind of performing differently from some other European countries. Far right views and particularly toxic anti-immigration attitudes. I was reading something the other day in some other European countries are a much, much bigger problem than they are here. There's plenty of people who want them to be problems here, and a lot of them are in the news at the moment. But that there is, that again, cause for some optimism there, which possibly, if we were to bend over backwards to be fair to Rishi Sunak on these comments, might be the sort of thing that he is referring to. I don't know if I ever buy the notion of it being human nature. It might be. Stephen Kirkham up in Lancashire says, racism, classism, all of it, it's everywhere. It's in all areas of life. It depends how and where you grow up and your own personal experience of it. I think you're probably right, but are you not fascinated by the idea of a sort of experiment? I mean, if you could raise everybody in kind of identical circumstances, I wonder how long it would take. I'm sure someone has done this experiment, for some people to start picking on others or distinguishing between others or ganging together against others based upon some weird attribute that wouldn't necessarily fit class or race.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12 is the time. You're always better informed than I am. Apparently there were some experiments similar to the one I just posited before the news, where they used eye colour. They kind of introduced the notion of discrimination according to eye colour among school children. Teachers used it to help the children understand the impact of racism and why it's so horrible. It's just as arbitrary, isn't it? Although, probably just a matter of time before one of the usual suspects writes an article about how your eye colour can denote your natural intelligence levels or something like that. I'm going to move on. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I will definitely return to it. But I want to move on, partly because we're going to need some of the time this hour to have a look at the Post Office campaigner Alan Bates's evidence to the Post Office inquiry this morning. There's a man who's had a good year, eh? I mean, he must have spent much of the previous few years despairing of ever achieving either justice or recognition. It doesn't seem like the kind of bloke who's that bothered about recognition, but my goodness me, he was bothered about justice. And now you say Alan Bates, I say Post Office. I say Post Office, you say Alan Bates. The man has covered himself in glory and is now giving, or has been giving, evidence to the Post Office scandal. Henry Staunton's evidence could be as interesting. He is the fellow who was appointed about a year ago to run the Post Office and fired a couple of weeks ago by Kemi Badenoch, which is odd given that he had absolutely nothing to do with any of the behaviour that formed the focus of that ITV drama. He was not involved in any of the scandal, but he was the one that Kemi Badenoch elected to get rid of for reasons that remain disputed. Both essentially accusing the other of lying. So that should be interesting as well, although I don't think that begins until Sheila Fogarty is on air. I don't know how tightly you can associate the next story we're going to talk about with the one that we had in the last hour, but it is about poverty. It's about a form of poverty. It is research from the Food Foundation. They have a tracker looking at the spending power and purchasing power of families up and down the country. They've been warning for some time of health inequalities, and when I tell you that a weekly basket of food, the price of a reasonably costed, adequately nutritious weekly basket of food. And I think those are important adjectives. Reasonably costed, adequately nutritious basket of food has gone up by, well, you tell me, how much do you think it's gone up by? I bet some, in fact, do you know what? Use your text, 84850. You can WhatsApp now, actually. How do you WhatsApp? Say again? Oh, it's the same. So WhatsApp the phone number, 0345 6060 It'd be nice to see if it's working. Or text 84850 or tweet at LBC. And just genuinely play the game properly, basing it entirely upon your shopping, entirely upon your food bills, because you look at the receipt and you know how much you're spending and you know how much it's changed. By how much would you say the average reasonably costed, adequately nutritious basket of food had gone up by in 2 years? Just send me a number now, all right, on that, and I'll have a look in a minute. Before I tell you the figure, I just want to see whether or not you already know as a consequence of your shopping habit. So it's not the headline inflation figure, it's your shopping. So you go shopping for food, and in 2 years, you think it's gone up by roughly how much? And so 100%. I mean, that's just silly. It hasn't gone up by 100%, unless you've changed from shopping at Lidl to shopping at Fortnum & Mason, in which case it's plausible that you might have seen an increase of something close to that sort of figure. But I just want to see, and then I'll run through it in a minute. I'll only keep that up till about 10 past, so be quick. Percentage we're looking for, not the figure in pounds. But what it means, and this is horrible, right? I had the enormous pleasure of interviewing Bernie Sanders last week. It was released on Friday as a full disclosure, although for once I'm not sure the title full disclosure did it justice, because it was very short. So it was partial disclosure, really, wasn't it? I think it barely came in at 40 minutes because his schedule was so busy. And Emily Maitlis was next door banging on the wall because she was interviewing him next, trying to disrupt. No, I'm joking. But she was interviewing him next for the newsagents. I think you sometimes need to hear stuff from other people, even if it's something you've been banging on about for years. And his almost incredulous anger or disapproval, incredulous disapproval at some of the issues of wealth distribution, I needed to be reminded, because sometimes the longer you spend in a mad situation, the easier it is to stop realizing that it's mad. The easier it is to forget that it's mad. And what Bernie Sanders said was that 3 people in America, I think it was Bezos, Gates and Musk, have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the population. Now, Gates does quite a lot of good work with his wealth. I don't know about the other 2, but it's just unjustified. 3 people in America, according to Bernie Sanders, and you must listen to that full disclosure, it's on the Global Player. 3 people. And I always find statistics like that popping into my head when I turn my attention to stories like this, because this is a story about 15% of UK households. That equals about 8 million adults and 3 million children experienced food insecurity in January, so last month alone. This is because of high food prices continuing to hit the pockets of relatively low-income families. And even, I would add, families who didn't really think of themselves as low-income until the price of a weekly basket of food increased by, and now I'm going to close that down. Good Lord, thank you. I'm going to close that down and give you a rough idea of what the shopping experience is. Barbara reckons hers has gone up by about 32%, so does Marlon. David says 23, which is actually bang on. I've got no way of knowing whether anybody's actually looked up the figure in the story. So most of you are going for around the 30% mark. Some of you are suggesting 78%, but I don't know how seriously I can take that. The actual figure is 24 to 26%. So for food alone, it doesn't include the petrol or the transport cost of getting to and from the supermarket. For food alone, it has gone up by 24 to 26%. And that's a basket of reasonably costed, adequately nutritious food. I've become a bit of a victim of my own success on this one, because There's too many for me to do any form of calculation or average. But I'm just doing it entirely by eye. You've erred slightly higher than the actual figure. You've erred more towards 30 to 35%, judging by your own shopping basket. Some of you have gone much higher than that. Hardly anyone has gone lower. Susanna in central London has gone for 20%, but that's just 4 points off the actual result. Most people have gone a little bit higher. There's a 13%, and that's quite interesting. Because what it means is, in an entirely unscientific and anecdotal fashion, you've really felt the pinch, even if you're good for it. Even if you've got the money, you've really felt the pinch of increased food prices. But I don't know whether or not you felt it to the point where you are hungry. So 15% of UK households now experiencing food insecurity, which means that you went hungry last month, effectively. Christopher's just pointed out that olive oil, if you buy olive oil, you can probably put the cost of your shopping up by an extra 10%. And I don't know what has happened to olive oil, but goodness me. My friend Andreas, who's got a greengrocers, gave me a big vat of olive oil at Christmas as a present, and I hadn't realised at the time how generous he was being. Olive oil, I tell you what, kids, get into olive oil. You're looking for a future job. It's extraordinarily expensive. And Dave has picked me up on the question of, I say Alan Bates, you say post office. Dave says, actually, James, you say Alan Bates, I say naked wrestling with Oliver Reed, which is a bit niche and probably not safe for work if you want to look it up. Here's the question that I've got. I want you to tell me about the first time you realised you didn't have enough food. Because people need to hear it. That's a big figure. That's 15% of UK households. That means roughly 15% of people listening to this programme have experienced that moment. I want you to tell me about the first time that it happened. And I must phrase this sensitively, but you have to have been shocked by it. I hope that being hungry is not a normal experience for you and wasn't a normal experience for you, but it's about that. I tell you why I need this. I need it to make the statistics come alive. I need it to make people realise that this is a real life issue rather than something that's happening on the extremities or just in the news. It's about being there. I don't know how the moment would translate. Do you realise at the checkout that you haven't got enough money? Are you making calculations as you make your way around the supermarket? Or are you running out of food before you've run out of month? Are you reaching the 27th, the 28th and looking at what's in the fridge and what's in the cupboard and thinking, I cannot get 6 meals out of this. I cannot feed the family. And I don't know what that would be like. And it's, in a sense, what I'm interested in is the realisation. That moment of realisation. What were the factors that came together at that point to mean that you, in the United Kingdom in 2024, couldn't afford food? That you were actually, or your family, probably parents, would go first, wouldn't they? Most of us would go hungry so that our children did not. But you've been there, and equally, you can't quite believe that it happened. I hope that's not crass. You'll soon let me know if it is. But that's what I want to hear. Okay, 0345 6060 973, because we need to make the story real. And just in case you're new to the programme, the way I'm built is very much there, but for the grace of God go I. I only very recently found myself no longer suffering from what Martin Amis used to call tramp angst. Some people grow up that way, some people don't. Some people think that they're, two paychecks away from oblivion, and other people never ever think about the prospect of the wheels coming off. I always had the prospect of the wheels coming off in the back of my mind. I don't know why, but I always thought that, all it takes is a slight change in the wind and we could be potless. And that is what it would be like. It would be I think that there's nothing more visceral than the purchase of food, is there? There's nothing more intrinsic to our existence, actually, than the supply of food to our families. And I want you to tell me about the moment, the very first time it happened, when you realise, good God, I can't afford it. 0345 6060 973. There's the number you need. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. I know it's not an easy call to make, but I think you can trust me. It is an important one. All right. 0345 6060 973. If food has gone up by 24 to 26% in the past 2 years, we shouldn't be surprised that 15% of UK households, 8 million adults, 3 million children are hungry as a consequence. And I just want you to help the rest of us understand what that's actually like. It's 12:16.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's well, look, it's my problem, not yours, but it is. People don't like to talk about it, do they? Particularly English people, not British people. I beg your pardon. The idea that 15% of us are going hungry as a consequence of food inflation, shrinkflation, cost of living, energy costs, all of it, running out of money before you've run out of month. But for those of us blessed to know nothing of what that would feel like, I do want some help in explaining. I do want some help in understanding what that is actually like and how shocked you are that it's happened to you. I don't think there's any shame or embarrassment to be had from thinking, I thought this happened to other people. I didn't think this kind of thing happened to people like me. If that is your category, then 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Alison, picking up on the olive oil point, which I grant you is a little unhelpful in the context of people who actually can't afford to eat. It is due largely to heat waves and droughts. So a climate crisis there being felt on supermarket shelves, whether we realise it or not. Let's go to Sonia, who's in Ivor. Sonia, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I've been living like this for at least 2 to 3 years, James. Ever since COVID, just after COVID hit.
Right.
I'm not going to lie, and I'm not going to say that I earn low wages. I don't earn megabucks either, but okay. I'm in a fairly decent job.
Yes.
But my priorities are my mortgage, my bills, which are hiked, mortgages have gone up, and everything else. So food comes last to me, and I eat only once a day. I get worried, things like I'm going away tomorrow. I won't say where I'm going. I work as an air hostess. I won't say which airline, but I'm going away for 4 days tomorrow, 5 days.
Yes.
I certainly won't be able to afford to eat over there, so whatever I will eat will be on the aircraft. It's not healthy food, but that's all I can have.
And
I'm not supposed to take anything off the aircraft, but I will.
Oh, be careful. I know. I mean, crikey, the last thing you need is to get into trouble for doing that. We were talking last week about a lady who got fired for eating a sandwich that she was supposed to just be clearing up. So it does happen. So, I mean, so some people, and I really respect you and thank you for calling in, because the very fact that you have a mortgage means that for an awful lot of people, it wouldn't have crossed their mind that people like you could end up in the situation that you currently find yourself in. Is it the interest rates that have done you? Is it?
Yeah, it's the interest rates. It's the energy crisis. They've really gone up. Wages haven't really gone up that much. What they should have. We had a cut during COVID, and we're not back to where we were. And like I said, I don't meet the criteria where I can claim anything. I've never claimed ever in my life, and I don't want to. But it's come to a point where I have to skip 2 meals and just have 1 meal a day.
How often are you hungry?
Some days I am hungry. Like this morning, I didn't have breakfast, and it's my day off today, but I didn't have breakfast. Right. I'm just going to have some rice and lentils and some pilchards that I made last night.
And when did you first realise? I know you said after COVID, but can you remember the moment? Were you at home? Were you in a shop? When did you first sort of go?
I was in a shop, and I was like, oh my God, is that the price of this? And I said, oh no, I'm going to have to skip it. I can't afford it.
And you work hard.
I work hard. I work damn hard. I try to avoid these packaged foods, and I don't, and I must say I don't. I do cook from scratch, but the only thing is that I skip meals.
Right.
I love to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I'm very good at cooking, and I do, but I just can't afford these prices these days.
No.
So the best thing is one day I might have breakfast, the next day I might just have dinner. That's it.
And of course, I think maybe, I'm not suggesting you're in this category, but I think I was. When we read that inflation is coming down, there's a little bit of us that thinks maybe that's maybe that means food's going to get cheaper, but inflation means that the prices are still going up. They're just not going up by as much as they were last time they checked, time they did the calculation.
Yeah.
Oh, I wish you well. I really do. And do be careful, Sonia. No one should be in the situation that you're in, but the fact that you're working that kind of job and enduring that kind of unfairness, I promise you, it will reach parts that more predictable calls or more predictable stories simply can't. Oh, my days, there's a lot of it out there. I work in a school, James, and on a daily basis, I see children who have free school meals run out of their daily allowance before lunch because of the cost of food. I don't fully understand that, but I won't say your name because you've asked me not to. As support staff, there have been days where I've seen the cost of the food. We, as staff, pay more than the kids and chosen not to eat, particularly in that final week before payday. How much, I wonder, of this is down to the fact that it's nutritious food we're talking about, that you maybe can just about fill your basket if you're buying stuff that isn't going to tick the boxes of healthy and nutritious or reasonably costed, adequately nutritious food, but you're still going hungry. So I don't know. I really don't. Would you go? Surely you'd eat anything as opposed to going hungry. 25 minutes after 12 is the time. The why of it may seem like a slightly crass question. The notion of sitting in one of the wealthiest countries in the world in 2024 and talking about 15% of UK households actually going hungry or experiencing food insecurity. If you want to broaden it out from the personal experience and have a crack at the question of how on earth... This is what I mean by that Bernie Sanders conversation that I had last week, and that sense that sometimes you do need someone else to give your head a wobble. You sit here thinking that this can't be right, and yet it goes on for so long, it becomes normalised, and you stop really recognising or realising how unjustified it is. You stop realising how ridiculous it is. Alex describes himself as 32 years old. His wife is a secondary school teacher. He works as a chef. Got a combined salary way ahead of what you'd be expecting. We talked about this last week, but with pets and children on the way, you're looking at food becoming more savvy over the years, shopping cheaper. It just doesn't seem to make any difference. The only way we've managed to keep fed is my job, because he works as a chef, and like Sonia, he's clearly taught bringing food home. 11% of food-secure households bought less fruit, and 6% purchased fewer vegetables. So, I mean, that idea of knowing that the food you're buying isn't nutritious is a different form of insecurity, isn't it? 60% of these households report buying less fruit. 44% report buying fewer vegetables. Talk a lot about processed food and the horrors of it, more than we ever have before. But if you understand anything about that, you'll realise how worrying this news is. If you are a food secure household, then you're spending 11% less on fruit and 6% less on vegetables. So it's not just the question of food insecurity. It's another. I told you there'd be links to the conversation in the last hour. It's another one about socioeconomic strata. Think about that just for a minute. Just for a minute, that idea that your access to fruit and vegetables is now diminished by your social class, by your socioeconomic status. I don't think it sounds silly to be shocked by that. I don't think it's an issue that you can chalk up as, oh, well, it was just like that in my day. You're talking about fruit and vegetables and the knowledge as you make your way around the supermarket that you can't afford. Sonia said she's going to have rice and lentils for a dinner with a tin of pilchards, which is last night's leftovers. Nothing fresh there at all. That knowledge as you make your way around the supermarket that you are, what's the word I'm looking for? That you are simply filling a hole inside you. You're not nourishing yourself. That I think that's a national tragedy. Paul's in Wantage. Paul, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi.
I think it was June time last year, my partner rang me up from work. She said, I've got the bus, I've got to work. I can't walk. So, well, I can pick you up. So I picked her up, and eventually we got into hospital that day, and she has something called cystitis, which is infection in your lower back.
Yes.
And she couldn't walk. So she had 6 months off work, couldn't walk for 4 months. So I had to take 4 months off work to look after her. She literally, lift her everywhere, carry her everywhere. And we were living off I'm self-employed carpenter. So obviously if I take time off work, that's it.
You don't get any money.
Don't get any money.
Sure.
And I think we were living on her £100 and something a week statutory sick pay. It might not have been that much, to be honest.
So she couldn't work because she was ill, and you couldn't leave her alone because you had to look after her, which meant you couldn't work. She couldn't walk.
Yeah.
So you're caught in a kind of Scylla and Charybdis of circumstances here, and the state support you get is just north of £100.
Yeah.
Gosh. So what happened?
Luckily, the family helped us with mortgage here and there when we paid them back, and we're still doing it now. But it was the food. It's going around the supermarket and budgeting, or trying to budget within that £100.
Yes.
But also it's knowing that you're not getting any money next week because she wasn't getting any better.
Yes.
And but the reason I rang was just to say it can happen to anyone. It always happens to someone else until it happens to you.
Both calls so far have been mortgage holders, which is kind of the point you're making, isn't it? I don't know why we'd presume that would not reach into as heavily into those sections of society. What about the actual food you ate? What kind of this notion of nutrition versus sort of quality versus quantity? Really, how did that impact on you?
Well, I enjoy cooking, so it's there's a bit of a challenge for me to be honest.
Yeah.
But it was the blue label stuff, obviously, or the yellow label stuff.
Yeah.
What's left over from the day and is just going off.
And then getting a couple of messages about the lad who's marking down the food in the supermarket come 4 o'clock in the afternoon now, being surrounded by people waiting to see what the discounts are going to be through necessity rather than any kind of proclivity for bargain hunting. Paul, thank you. Take care. 12:31 is the time. This notion of hunger in 21st century Britain, how would you make it real for somebody listening? Not a complete clown like 30p Lee with his nonsense about being able to cook up nutritious meals for 2 shillings, but somebody who just thinks it can't, who just disputes what Paul just told us. That idea that it can happen to anybody. There's someone listening to this thinking, no, it really couldn't. How would you reach them? How do you make the reality of actual hunger in 21st century Britain unignorable for a well-meaning but sceptical onlooker? All right, that's your challenge. That's your homework, and I want as many entries as possible on 0345 6060 973. It's 12:32, and Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:36 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where this question, it's one of the hardest things to do on the radio, is to find a sensitive way of highlighting hunger. Because think how likely you would be if you're a million miles away from this story. How likely is it that you'd ring me now and tell me that you actually routinely go hungry? And the reason I come back to it, despite that, is because I think that's the point. We need to understand it better. We need to appreciate the reality of it. And the calls so far today have done that really quite perfectly by dint of both people being, by their own analysis, in sections of society where they would not expect this sort of thing to happen. It shouldn't happen to anybody. But if I asked you who you think it might happen to, you'd be wrong, because it could happen to anyone. Andrew's in Swansea. Andrew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. It's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. Well, I should say we'll see at this point.
Okay. I've been running a charity down here for 3 years. We work with disadvantaged kids and their families, teaching them how to cook healthy food.
Yes.
And something happened last week that really brought it home to me, just how difficult it's becoming. I've seen it over the last 2 years, but this occasion that happened last week, I was cooking with a mom and her daughter, and she was eating something that we'd made which had gluten in it.
Right.
And she told me the week before that she was gluten intolerant. And I said, you do realise that there's gluten in here? And she said yes, and looked a bit embarrassed and looked at her feet and said, but it's cheap.
Wow. And I'm not a medic, but that obviously the health impacts of that are pertinent, aren't they?
I'm gluten intolerant myself, so I know what.
Well, give us a quick heads up on what it kind of means.
Yeah, it means grumbling stomach, really double over with pain, and you don't want to be too far away from a bathroom for a little while.
I understand what you're saying. Good Lord.
It's pretty unpleasant. So I'm seeing her again tomorrow, and I honestly don't know what I'm going to say or do with her. Because it just shocked me. She knew full well what she was doing to herself.
But she has to eat. She'd choose that discomfort. She's prioritising one discomfort over another, really.
You've got it. And we were meeting, it's at 2 in the afternoon. It was the first thing she'd eaten.
How frustrated are you by what I've just described? You're probably too busy to be frustrated. But people are not going to come forward and share the reality of what they're experiencing because of stigma and shame.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I would note is when I first started this charity, it was really easy to talk with the kids and their moms about eating healthily on a budget.
Right.
Quite honestly now, it's probably cheaper to go and buy a packet of biscuits than it is to go and buy fresh vegetables.
And that's the story, really, which that's why the words reasonably costed, but adequately nutritious are in the story as well. So even against that backdrop, 15% of families are hungry. But if you were to actually extend that to people who are not hungry, but who are, I mean, your case is extreme, not hungry, but eating things that make them ill.
But eating things that they shouldn't be eating.
Or just eating things that are not good for them, that are not nourishing.
Yeah. Because now, if you look at, for instance, we do some work on trying to make your own version of a pot noodle.
Yeah, okay.
And 2 or 3 years ago, that was easy. You could easily undercut the price of a pot noodle.
Right.
It's actually not so easy now.
Oh,
because the price of oil, the price of stock, the price of vegetables has just gone up and up.
And the price of wages hasn't.
Exactly.
Plot me a graph briefly, if you could, Andrew, about the sort of time. Are things worse than they've ever been? Have they improved a bit since inflation started coming down? Are they? Do you see what I mean? Just give me a rough overview.
I see what you mean. I can only do it over the last 4 years. James,
yeah, that's perfect.
That's how long we've been going. It's clear from the conversations that we have with the moms and the dads that it's as bad now as it's ever been.
And yet not getting anything like the attention, perhaps, A, that it should, and B, that it did when we were still unfamiliar with food bank proliferations or still unfamiliar with this idea. It's an out of sight, out of mind kind of issue. And the work that people like Andrew do largely happens in the darkness. And it's not something that people necessarily queue up to talk to me about, although thankfully today people are sharing their stories. If you want to share yours, 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. There's a lot of it about. I mean, that much is clear. Jim in Cumbria reminds us that the impact hunger has. He says, can you imagine the awful impact hunger has? As an adult, all thought processes will be under stress, and as a child, your actual body will be under stress. And Ash says, I'm gluten intolerant and I eat bread with gluten in it because it's filling, and it's now about £3 for a loaf of gluten-free bread. My kids need feeding first, so my health comes second. Fanny's in Cheltenham. Fanny, what made you pick up the phone?
I picked up the phone because my job is as a certified money coach. So I've had the privilege of looking at people's finances in depth over the last, 8-10 years that I've been doing this professionally.
Okay.
And I've noticed a big change in the last couple of years.
Right.
Because obviously I need to pay my bills, my work tends to be with the wealthier people.
Yes.
Over time. But what I'm noticing now is, especially with the mortgage hikes that have been the major culprit, I would say, in this, is that it used to be a lovely program where I go, okay, let's work out, look, you've got all this spare cash that you can start investing with. But now what we're doing is we're trying to work out what's the best bill not to pay so that they can afford to live. And I think one of the things that happens that with what I suppose we might say middle class people who earn the average salary and above, well, they're all right. You tend to have a lifestyle that fits. you want to have a nicer car, you want to have maybe a slightly bigger house. And when these inflation rates and mortgage interest rates hit, sometimes for those people, they actually hit harder. And there are some really big choices for many to make now, including myself. I mean, I've been hit with a huge mortgage on a rental property, which I'm very blessed to have, which means I now have no profit from it at all, which means my income's gone down.
Yes, because we all cut our cloth accordingly. I think this is. I mean, the problem is, and I'm glad you've rung in because you make a really powerful point. But I mean, it's a bit like that conversation last week of people on $100,000, a joint income of $100,000 a year, struggling to make ends meet. There is perhaps a danger of crowding out the people who are really skint. But the point is that if you have those outgoings at the end of every month, then short of moving house, which is A, difficult, and B, stressful, and C, time-consuming, short of moving house, there's actually nothing you can do. So you could be technically just as short of money by the end of the month as somebody who's on a fraction of what you're on because of the decisions that perfectly reasonable decisions that you've made over the previous few years. Yeah, and also, bearing in mind, I mean, have you seen how many houses are on the market of a sort of a higher price limit? I mean, I went through a thought of, well, I'll just sell it. Right. Oh, yeah. It looks like I made that decision on exactly the same day as half the population of Cheltenham. I didn't know that. So a lot of people are trying to downsize or divest themselves of investments that have become unattractive, that aren't delivering the dividends that you thought they would deliver when you bought them. I mean, it's world's smallest violin territory on one level, but it's just real life on another level, and one shouldn't be excluded from the conversation because of the urgency of the other. Well, what's the light at the end of the tunnel then? What does that look like, in your professional opinion? What I'm seeing is if we were to use the middle class terminology without putting any judgment to it and just use it for a framework to hang our hat on, to use as a hook to hang something on. What I'm seeing many people of the middle class hanging on by their fingertips. Waiting for something to come up, as Mr. McCorber said. Well, it's almost like a split. Let's not get this wrong. There are plenty of very wealthy people in this country, and there are plenty of people making plenty of money. But there are many people in that middle band that are literally hanging on, and with the mortgage increases, it's literally sinking. They're running out of savings. They're running up credit card debt. I'm going to crack on simply because the break is around the corner, and between you and me, I'm absolutely desperate for the loo. But the figures I'll share with you immediately afterwards are the hospital admissions for nutrition-related diagnoses. We'll have a little look about how they've changed after the last decade, and I'll tell you now, if your hair's not on the end already, it will be shortly.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. I want to stress that Idiot's Corner is sometimes an affectionate invitation. It sometimes comes from a place of love and concern. It's a bit like the naughty step. If I decide to put you in Idiot's Corner, it's so that you can reflect upon your behaviour and hopefully improve. This one's unsigned, but it's going straight into Idiot's Corner. I presume when you wrote garage, you meant garbage. So this has come in response to the news from the Food Tracker that 15% of families in the country are facing food poverty. Our friend here writes, utter garbage radio. Just look at the new cars on the road. Just look at how many holidays people are taking. Just look at how fully booked restaurants are. Give me a break, James. G's, with several E's. I'm only going to say one sentence to you. I want you to write it down and look at it while you spend a few hours in Idiot's Corner. Imagine that you'd never had a cold, right? You've never had a cold. Or even imagine you're in a room full of people that have never had a cold. Would you seriously argue or contact a national radio station to claim that the common cold has never and does not exist? Would you? I don't think so. 12:50 is the time. Alan Bates, who makes most of us think of the post office, but makes Dave in Colchester think of the naked wrestling scene with Oliver Reed in, I think, was it Women in Love? The film adaptation, the Ken Russell film adaptation of the D.H. Lawrence novel. I could be wrong. Natasha Clark certainly looks puzzled.
I look very puzzled because I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, not that Alan Bates.
This Alan Bates.
Yeah.
We have been hearing from the other Alan Bates, the former post office
who, to the best of our knowledge, has
postmaster.
never wrestled nakedly with
haven't
Oliver
asked
Reed
him.
or indeed anybody else,
I don't
as far
think
as we're aware.
we should definitely not slander him in
No,
in
there's
that
been
way.
quite enough of that on the programme today already.
I've heard. But yes, he's been speaking to MPs today. He said he cannot see an end to the post office scandal, with attempts to redress postmasters not getting fairer and faster. We've heard from him and two other postmasters talking to MPs on the Business Select Committee today. They've told how there was a culture that they just did not get believed when they were trying to speak about how the dodgy accounting software system Horizon was basically giving them, meaning that all of their numbers just did not add up. They told of the hell that they went through to get that compensation over the scandal. Obviously, Alan Bates, the campaigner whose fight for justice inspired that recent ITV documentary, which really propelled it to the top of the political agenda. He told MPs to just get on and pay people. Asked whether he'd heard anything reassuring during this morning's session, Mr. Bates said, "No, I'm afraid not. It's very disappointing. This has been going on for years. I cannot see any end to it." He said he thought the post office was a dead duck, and it has been for years, and should be sold off to Amazon.
I think over the years I've been dealing with post office, the culture's always been post office. It hasn't changed. It's been the same for donkey's years. It will not change, and you cannot change it. My personal view about post office is it's a dead duck, and it has been for years, and it's going to be a money pit for the taxpayer for years to come, and you should sell it to someone like Amazon for £1, get really good contracts for all the serving sub-postmasters, and within a few years you'll have one of the best networks around.
He also called on ministers to strip the post office out of all the compensation schemes, saying they were continuing to hold up some of the payments being made. Another postmaster, Tony Downey, he gave what I thought was probably the best sort of testimony that I'd really heard from any of the postmasters. It was very emotional. He told the committee how he'd had a mental breakdown, he'd went bankrupt, and he even had to put his daughter in a school in another country after facing action over his own missing payments.
Shortfalls from day one. I was suspended, but allowed to have my job back if we went to the bank and got £3,000 to pay into the system. And then I had the threat of if I had any more shortfalls, it was my fault and my business would be closed. So then I kept them hidden from the post office and from everybody else until we ran out of money. We used our credit cards. Forced to sell the business, declared bankrupt. I had a nervous breakdown. We left the village, ran away without saying goodbye to our friends, put our daughter in school in another country, never been back to the UK for 15 years, apart from these last few weeks.
And earlier on in the day, we heard from an official at the Department for Business. He denied those claims that were made by Henry Staunton, that they were told to delay those payments for those caught up in the Horizon scandal. Carl Cresswell, he's a director of business resilience. He's in charge of making those post office payments, said those claims made by Mr. Staunton were just not true. He said he was told by members of the post office board that they would have resigned if he was not removed. He also said that the total cost of compensation is set to reach more than £1 billion.
You would have thought that someone would have mentioned it to me if that were the intent. Not at all. I worked very closely with Sarah Munby. She and I worked with Treasury to secure the funding needed for the schemes that I've mentioned, the overturned convictions scheme, the GLO compensation scheme. Every conversation I had with her, with ministers, with other senior civil servants in other parts of government have all been about how can we pay out this money more quickly. So no, that is completely incorrect, that assertion.
We're expecting to hear more from Henry Staunton after lunch. He's meant to be giving his first appearance in front of MPs, so it'll be interesting to see whether we've got any more bombshell claims for him that were not revealed in that Sunday Times article from a few weeks ago.
Is there
Mr.
any...
Bates, perhaps I could come to you first. Could you tell us, since you've given evidence to this committee before, is the redress getting faster and fairer?
Well, speaking personally of my claim, I can say no. It is no.
After everything you've been through?
Yeah, nothing. It's still, as far as I know, it's still sat there. We've refused it, and that's it. That's where the process is in my case.
That was Alan Bates saying that he had not had any confirmation that things had got any better since he first told his story. So yes, it was quite an emotional appearance from some of those postmasters today.
Is there any likelihood of getting full clarity on the Henry Staunton Kemi Badenoch spat?
I just don't think there is. I think it's going to be a he said, she said.
I mean, because he's got a contemporaneous note of a conversation that he said took place, to which you can respond by saying, no, I mean, it would work in a court of law, or at least it would be considered, it would be taken into account by a judge in a court of law. He would advise the jury accordingly. But in a public spat, in a media spat, it's essentially just, no, I didn't. That's not my recollection of the conversation, despite your contemporaneous note. So you can't. I don't think we're going to get beyond that.
That's exactly what I fear is going to happen. I don't think we're ever going to find out what the truth is, because it doesn't feel like either side has any documents to claim it or to claim that it never happened either. It doesn't feel like there is any actual physical proof. He's obviously recorded what he believes to be the outcome of that conversation, but there isn't a recording, we believe, of that conversation that he had. So yes, it very much is going to be a case of one word against the other, I fear, by the end of the day.
Yes, and the decision to get rid of Henry Staunton, I suppose we need to wait to see whether that gets challenged in any way by Henry Staunton.
Yes, and that's exactly what Carl Creswell said earlier today. He's saying that there were people on the board that were not happy with him, and obviously Kemi Badenoch has said in the House of Commons that she believes that he was the under investigation for possible bullying allegations at the time. Now, those, as we spoke about the other week, they're not allegations that the Prime Minister himself has repeated.
Yes.
So it'd be interesting to hear whether the MPs and whether they bring up and whether they question Henry Staunton himself, or were you part of any sort of bullying or HR investigation at the time. But yes, it's obviously very clear that there was a lot of trouble, obviously, with his appointment and obviously his inevitable sacking.
We shall, it's not going away, but anybody who's expecting major fireworks is probably going to be disappointed. And of course, anybody involved in the sub-postmaster scandal is probably more interested in the compensation process than they are in any spats between the SAC chairman and the business secretary.
Yes, that's right. And the government is saying they're still coming forward with that legislation, but it has been about 6 weeks since the government said that was coming forward. So I don't think it's without urgency. That's meant to be coming forward in the next few weeks. We understand the government hope that it will essentially overturn all of those convictions for those sub-postmasters that face those wrongful convictions by the summer. In terms of those compensation payments, ministers hope to pay them by August. But yes, they are very much facing delays, and those postmasters talking today about how delayed they have been.
Thank you, Natasha Clark. The appearances, or rather that select committee hearing, continues throughout the afternoon, where, as Natasha just reminded us, Henry Staunton is due to give evidence later, and no doubt she will be bringing you up to date with developments in the course of Sheila's show, or possibly Tom Swarbrick's, because, well, it's not Sheila even, it's Sangeeta Maiska standing in for Sheila. If you missed any of this show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, including a rather extraordinary... Is it a record? Did we delay the news at 11 o'clock for longer than ever? Do you think, Keith? It was certainly up there, wasn't it? Find out why by listening back on Catch Up, where you can also, of course, pause and rewind live radio. Download now for free from your app store, the Global Player, or just head to globalplayer.com. And as I say, Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now, standing in for Sheila Fogarty, it's time for Sangeeta Maiska.
James O'Brien on LBC.